I have a great deal of respect for the presidency of the United States, and I took no great pleasure in having to contradict the president. He wanted desperately for this outbreak to go away.
Is this kind of just media hype, or should we be doing more to make sure we're not incubating the next pandemic?
And farm workers spread it among the cows and back and forth. It keeps spreading in that circuit between farm workers and cattle and cats on the farm and chickens on the farm. It's going to mutate to be able to efficiently go from human to human. When a human is infected, the mortality is close to 50%. They would put me before a committee and say, when are you going to give us our freedom back?
In 2020, we just didn't have sufficient evidence to see where COVID-19 could have come from. It sounded like you suggested it would have a natural origin, and that was the thing, right? The bat at the wet market, especially once China started to block international investigations and look like they were kind of covering things up. Why not back then just say, hey, we don't know?
If you really listen carefully, I've always had an open mind.
Do you support an investigation into the lab leak theory? It seems like you were born to be a public health official, with your father being the neighborhood pharmacist and delivering prescriptions on your Schwinn bike back in the day. Did you have designs on this kind of career early in the game?
No, Jordan, I don't think I could say that I had designs on this kind of career. What I did feel, both at the time vaguely, though I probably didn't recognize it, but later when I retrospectively reflected on it, the fact that my father was sort of in his pharmacy, a mom and pop shop in a working class section of Brooklyn, the pharmacies then were very different than the industrial CVS and Walgreens type pharmacies that we have now. The neighborhood pharmacist was kind of like the surrogate doc of the neighborhood. He was a combination marriage counselor, person who advises parents on juvenile delinquent children, gets prescriptions filled. And he felt a kind of responsibility to the neighborhood. And I was, we're talking the 40s and the 50s now. And I was at the time, 7, 8 years old, 9 years old, 10 years old with my, as you mentioned, my Schwinn bicycle delivering prescriptions. The one thing that came through to me was my father's commitment to service to the community, because quite frankly, with no disrespect for my father, he was a terrible businessman in that, people could not afford sometimes to pay for the prescriptions. So he would put it on a tab. And often, if they were not well off financially, they couldn't pay, and he would just absorb the cost, which made the pharmacy not a particularly profitable business. I mean, could you imagine today going into a pharmacy saying, I can't pay, but give me the prescription anyway? It would never happen. So service to the community was sort of ingrained in me, and that was subsequently enhanced by the nature of my education, with the Dominican nuns in elementary school and then the Jesuit priests in high school, whose motto was service for others. So in answer to your question, it wasn't like I foresaw this as my avocation later on, but I think the seeds of what drove me to public health and public service were probably planted in those very early years in the Bensonhurst and Dyker Heights section of Brooklyn, New York.
It sure seems that way from the reading of the book, that you were kind of, aside from your little foray into basketball, you were kind of headed in a more or less straight line. By the way, 5'7" white guy playing basketball with big, you don't hear that too often anymore. That's a relic of the times.
Indeed, and that's why I described it as such. It was a very important, enjoyable period of my youth, playing in a very competitive New York City high school basketball, but being a fast 5'7" point guard today is an anomaly that would never happen.
Right. Yeah, maybe if you grew 6 to 12 inches, you could still do it. Do you still ball?
I go one-on-one occasionally, fun, playing horse with my wife up in the gym. I used to go half-court games in medical school and when I was doing my fellowship, but right now it's tough to get a group of people who are so busy together to play. So I just shoot around. I'm on the faculty now at Georgetown University, and they have a great uh, uh, the center, athletic center, the AIDS Center. And so I go up there to work out a bit, and every once in a while I just shoot around.
So somebody might walk in there, and if you're wondering who the 5'7" man with white hair shooting hoops is, it could be Dr. Fauci. That's kind of that's a double take, I think, for a lot of people. For
Yeah,
sure.
it's kind of fun
Yeah.
dealing with the students. I love them.
Yeah, well, they're probably not screaming at you. Speaking of which, I know you were attacked in the 80s. This is stuff most people my age don't know because we weren't watching the news back then, but you were attacked a lot in the 80s pretty viciously for not doing enough about the AIDS virus to sort of put it in a simple container. And one of your harshest critics back then actually later said that you were the one true hero from the government with respect to the AIDS epidemic. And I know that you've been quoted possibly before COVID as saying that your career and indeed your identity was sort of defined by the fight against HIV.
Well, that is true. It was defined by AIDS. It's a memoir, as you mentioned. I'm an 83-year-old person.
You almost did you almost say elderly?
Yeah, I almost did.
You don't have to do that to yourself.
Yeah. I mean, but I'm 83. I'm a young 83. But COVID is a very small fraction of my career. I mean, most of it is defined by what you mentioned earlier, is HIV/AIDS. I spent over 40 years in the AIDS battle, from the very difficult years in the beginning to the triumphs of the drug. But the point you're making about the activists, I'm glad you pointed out, because it's a major part of the book that contrasts and compares the attacks on me in the AIDS years and the attacks on me now. Back then, the underlying reason for the confrontation with the AIDS activist community was that the scientific community and the regulatory community, in the form of the NIH and the CDC and the FDA, were treating HIV the way they successfully treated a bunch of other diseases, where the people who would be dictating how things were done were the scientists and the regulatory people. And they had very rigid criteria, for example, for entry into clinical trials, entry criteria, exclusion criteria, a long time to get a drug approved, measured in years and years. That worked very well for diseases in getting interventions that were safe and effective to the American public. But when you had a disease that was a brand new disease, the likes of which we had never seen before, where these desperately ill, young, almost exclusively gay men who had been previously healthy were suffering and dying within 10 to 15 months of the clinical diagnosis. So this slow, rigid, kind of measured response to the outbreak did not work well for HIV. But the scientific community, understandably but inappropriately, said, we know what's best for you because we've done this before. And the gay community was saying, well, not so. We want to sit at the table with you. We want to be part of the discussion of what the right agenda would be for clinical trials and for regulation. And when the scientific community didn't listen to them, that's when they became provocative, iconoclastic, disruptive, and confrontative. Most of the scientific community pulled back and withdrew even more from them.
Right.
And as I describe in the memoir, one of the best things that I've ever done, of the things in my, half a century career, was to put aside the theatrics of the demonstration and listen to what they were saying. And what they were saying was making absolutely perfect sense. And I decided that if I were in their shoes, I would be doing exactly what they were doing. So I can best describe it by saying it's kind of like John Lewis, the iconic civil rights leader, said, they made trouble, but they made good trouble. So the AIDS activists were making good trouble. What you're seeing today with the vitriol and the ad hominem attacks on scientists is not good trouble. That's just pure ad hominem to try and discredit and undermine the scientific and public health community. We're not perfect by any means, and we've done things that we could have done better. But to attack the community with no purpose but to undermine them is infinitely different than the pushback by the AIDS activists in the 1980s. A big, big difference.
Yeah, I was going to jump into some of this later, and I suppose we could, but some people really hated you under Bush because of the AIDS stuff. Then it was Ebola under Obama, Trump because of COVID, Biden because of the COVID vaccines. What do you hope people will hate you for next, Dr. Fauci?
Well, I don't know how to answer that. The one thing that has been consistent with me is that I have done everything I can with whatever abilities I have and energy I have to put all of my energies into trying to preserve and protect the health of the American public. Sometimes that's in circumstances that are very charged, and sometimes people react. And as I mentioned, the reaction of the gay community in the 80s was a very positive and value added reaction. In contrast to what you saw at that congressional hearing a few weeks ago, which was just pure circus.
I really do think that a lot of those hearings now are designed to create social media clips for the politicians because they've essentially become Instagram influencers in many ways, or news clip influencers, which I don't think is healthy for public discourse. But that's a whole different rant from me, I suppose.
No, you're absolutely correct. I mean, you are totally correct that if you look at things like the congressional hearings, the supposed purpose of it was to take a look at potential lessons learned about how we might do better in preparedness and response for the inevitability of another and the next outbreak, be that a year from now or 20 years from now. But that's not what took place. What took place was, just as I mentioned, pure ad hominem and pure vitriol.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like it makes it easier for people to do their jobs. I wonder, how did what you experienced during the outbreak of HIV/AIDS inform your response to the COVID-19 pandemic, right? Because it seems like, new disease, we got to act fast. We didn't act as fast as we could have or should have during HIV/AIDS. Was that kind of like, let's not make that mistake again? Was there thought to that?
Well, you always learn from your experiences.
Hopefully,
Yeah, that's right. Hopefully, and we try very much to learn from our experiences. There are a lot of lessons learned, some positive lessons and some painful lessons. I mean, for example, I could think of one or two, but one that sticks out that I describe in the memoir is that even though in the mid to late 80s it was eminently clear that HIV was the cause of AIDS, there was some otherwise qualified scientists who went rogue and started saying that HIV didn't cause AIDS. They were AIDS denialists. And they said, well, AIDS is caused by aberrant sexual behavior that has nothing to do with the virus. And when you try and treat them with drugs, it's the drugs that are hurting them. And the virus is, essentially benign. And that led to, in another country, namely South Africa, to have the South Africans who were sort of ambivalent about providing drugs for their people to latch on to the denialists from very good institutions like Berkeley and Stanford and others, and to say, well, the scientists don't think that AIDS is caused by HIV, so we don't have to give drugs to our people. And people who've done modeling studies showed that during that period of time, when Thabo Mbeki, who was the president of South Africa at the time, and their health minister, Manto Shalabala, they said that we don't want to give drugs because we don't think the virus causes HIV. And approximately 300, the virus causes AIDS, approximately 300,000 South Africans unnecessarily died preventable deaths because of denialism. Fast forward 40 plus years, and you have people that say, you don't need to wear a mask. The virus kills you I mean, the vaccine kills you worse than the virus kills you.
Right.
And then you have a substantial segment of people who actually believe that and
Yeah.
test assess the data that it is more likely for you to die or be hospitalized with COVID if you're a Republican living in a red state than if you're a Democrat living in a blue state. And that's completely crazy that a person makes a decision about something that could impact their safety, their life, the fact that they might be hospitalized or die based purely on ideological concerns. As a person who's not political at all, I'm not a Democrat, I'm not a Republican, I'm a physician and a scientist. It's very painful for me to see people choosing to not implement or apply an implementation that could be life-saving to them or to their families.
Yeah, it was really shocking. Well, we saw people saying, "Hey, it's the ventilator that's killing you," and it's well, wait, aren't they only putting people who are close to death on ventilators because they can't breathe? And no, the hospitals are killing you. And when I was reading your book and doing research about the HIV/AIDS thing, it was really scary how similar these pandemics were. It was people telling you in the 80s, calling you saying, hey, don't waste too much time on this HIV thing. It's probably going to go away in a few months like magic. They also called it GRID, gay-related immune deficiency. In other words, who cares? It's a bunch of gay guys. Stop wasting your time on it. I mean, talk about politically incorrect disease nomenclature. It was just really, the denialism was there, like you said, the kooky theories that were there, like you said. And I looked up some sham cures, all present with COVID, just like it was with AIDS. And it's really amazing to see once you know the history. Because if you were thinking, I'm going to do this sham cure for COVID, but then you go look at anything having to do with AIDS in the 80s, you just kind of look at the stack of stuff you bought from Thailand on your desk and throw it immediately in the trash because it's the same nonsense.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely correct. History repeats itself. And in fact, if you go back even further to 1918 pandemic flu, about people, some of whom refused to wear a mask, some of which refused to have social distancing, and how that came back to really bite them back then because they didn't want to be told what to do. And there was some really interesting studies of one city that actually shut down and had physical distancing compared to another city that actually said, to heck, let it rip, let it go through. It's not going to bother us. And the death rate and the hospitalization rate in one versus the other was stunning. Very similar to what we're talking about now.
I was looking at some stuff about germ theory a few months back and how people, especially doctors delivering babies who had just been at the morgue touching a dead body, they were like, oh, this is a bunch of BS. I mean, it's really, you just see this cycle of like denying science and not bothering to change your ways. And it's sort of, I guess, no surprise that they say science advances one funeral at a time. It just depends on whose funeral it is. A lot of unproven drugs with AIDS, although that part I kind of understand, right? If you have AIDS and you're not able to get any treatment and somebody says, hey, just dilute bleach in water and drink it every hour, I guess, you try what you can because you don't want to die. That's the only thing I can sort of understand.
Well, I have to maybe just put an editorial on that.
Sure.
Is that, it's true when there's desperate nature, but that's what the clinical trial process is about, to get a clinical trial to prove or not whether a drug works, whether it's effective and whether it's safe. One of the things that we did with the help of the activists, because the clinical trial does not meet everyone's needs, because not everybody can be in a clinical trial. And as long as you're going in the direction of trying to get data that would either prove or disprove the safety and efficacy, that's a positive thing. But in the meantime, you might want to have access to these drugs in people who, for one reason or other, could not get into the clinical trial, either because of exclusion criteria, because of geographic considerations. And that's why we started the parallel track program, which I described in the memoir, where it was the first foundation for compassionate use, where if people could not get into a clinical trial, that the drug would be made available to them outside of the clinical trial or in parallel. That's why we called it a parallel track. And that would not count against the data in the trial. So you would not disturb the pristine nature of the clinical trial, but at the same time, you'll allow the accessibility of these potentially but unproven life-saving drugs to people who could not be in the clinical trial.
I know that you were in charge of prepping the United States for bioterrorism, like smallpox, anthrax. How prepared are we for something like that? Because when I look at how people wouldn't do sort of some of the simplest things for COVID when we didn't know what we were dealing with, it seems like if we had a major bioterror attack, a bunch of people would say it's fake. A bunch of people would say it's a false flag. A bunch of people would say it's China. A bunch of people would say it's not actually happening at all, and you should actually just go outside and get more sun, even though you're supposed to stay inside. Whatever it is, I mean, it's not looking good as far as that kind of.
When you talk about preparedness and response, I generally, for clarity, like to break it up into two categories or two buckets. One is the scientific response and preparedness, and the other is the public health preparedness and response. Scientifically, if you were to grade us for COVID, we were A+, because we put decades of investment in basic and clinical research over, a period of time that allowed us, when the sequence of the SARS-CoV-2 was made available, we were able to start a vaccine trial with a very adaptable platform and immunogen, and an immunogen is just the business end of the vaccine. We were able to do that within a few days of the appearance in a public database of the sequence. And then in a completely unprecedented way, we went through the phase 1, 2, and 3 components of the clinical trials and were able to demonstrate in less than 11 months, in studying tens of thousands of people in randomized placebo-controlled trials, that the vaccines is safe and highly, highly effective, to the tune of more than 90%. To say that is unprecedented is a profound understatement, because usually something like that takes 7 to 10 or more years, usually more than that. So already, when you look at the data, the vaccines have saved millions of lives in the United States. The Commonwealth Fund did a study over a couple of year period during the middle of the outbreak to show that vaccinations saved 3 million lives, 18 million hospitalizations, and about $1.1 trillion in healthcare costs. And the Europeans and others did the same thing. And that saved about 14 million lives internationally. So it was just extraordinary. That not only is an incredible accomplishment, but just think what would have happened if we didn't have a vaccine and it took 5 to 7 years to get it. How many more deaths there would have been. So scientifically, we did well. What we really need, and you alluded to it when you introduced the topic, what we really need to do is to take a look at what our public health preparedness and response is. The fractionation of the response between the local public health and the federal public health response, the antiquated way we collect and distribute data, with some local public health components still using fax machines and not being able to get things online in real time. When you compare that, what goes on in countries like Israel, the UK, and South Africa, they're way ahead of us in getting real-time information in an outbreak. And in fact, during the height of the outbreak, more often than not, I was on this screen that I am with you, talking to my colleagues in the middle of the night or very early in the morning in different countries, in Israel, UK, South Africa, Australia, to find out what they were doing, because their healthcare system allowed them to get information in real time, which was very difficult for us. Hopefully, the CDC recognizes that that is a problem and are doing everything they can to correct that.
I do think my favorite nickname for the vaccine was the Fauci ouchie. That one was pretty creative. I don't know. You must have been hearing this in real time and thinking like, really?
Yeah.
Surely some of this was massively stressful. We'll get into that in a little bit. It just before we do that, during the Zika virus outbreak, you lamented that partisan politics might affect the next disease breakout, and it might get even worse. And I'm paraphrasing here, but man, did that come true with COVID. It was just really sad to see. I know you were working like 14 to 16 hours a day for much of your career, especially during the pandemic. Do you ever, I know you have kids as well. Did you ever think like you worked a little bit too much at the expense of family and maybe even your sanity?
Um, I don't know about the sanity, but certainly
Well,
the
mental health. How's
yeah,
that?
mental health. I admit that I'm guilty that I'm not the poster child for a good work-life balance, but that was really kind of the circumstances I found myself in and that I chose to be in. Because, if you look at my career, it's bookended by the extraordinary tragedy of the early years of HIV on one end of the early part of my career, and in the December of my career, by the most impactful outbreak that we've seen in this planet in over 100 years. And in the middle is the diseases that you mentioned. The pandemic flu of 2009, Zika, Ebola, the anthrax attacks, chikungunya, multiple drug resistant tuberculosis. There was always some crisis or semi crisis, which actually did, put me in a position where I had to make sacrifices. And certainly I would have wished that I was able to spend more time with my family, with my wife and my children. Fortunately for me, I had a partner who I describe in the book, Dr. Christine Grady, who's my wife, who's an amazing person and who actually was a great support for me for what I had to do and just went the extra mile to make sure that the family unit, functioned really well. And we did some interesting things about timing so that we could be together, even if it was at very odd hours of the day and night. She was very good at making sure we stood together as a loving family.
Yeah, there's a funny anecdote in the book where you two decided to run a marathon together and you were like, well, let's hold hands across the finish line. And she's like, actually, I love you dearly. And then she just smokes you and finishes several seconds before you, which I think says a lot about your relationship and her personality in one tiny little anecdote.
She's great. I mean, I throw that anecdote because she is amazing. I mean, she's a wonderful person, and I still think we have the intensity of a love affair that started 40 years ago. But she's a great athlete, and she's in good shape. And when we got to the end, I was sort of like, oh my God, I'm in such great pain. We're at 26.1 miles. And we did that. We were running together and chatting for that period of time. We did a great time in the Marine Corps Marathon. We did it in 3 hours and 47 minutes. And in the New York Marathon, we did it in 4 hours and 6 minutes,
Wow.
except that both times she was about 15 seconds ahead of me because just at that last tenth of a mile, she would say, I'm sorry, but I got to give it my all. And she took off. And you're right, she
Wow.
smoked me at the end.
That's it's really funny, and it's even better that you told that anecdote in the book instead of being embarrassed about it or something like that. I think it's quite funny. Um, in part because of COVID, you're now one of the most recognizable, famous / infamous people in the world. And I know that's not probably why you signed up for the position that you did. But for example, one reason why we're not doing this in person was because the publicist that I spoke to had said, I said, look, I'll fly out there. We'll do this. She said, actually, it's really the security situation is such that it's going to be a huge pain to get you cleared and then your camera crew cleared, especially if they're local. And I thought like, wow, okay. I didn't really think about that. Usually I just show up with guys with equipment and nobody's got to look through the bags and do a background check. But, and maybe I'm a pretty sketchy guy, so I guess I can't blame them. But it sounds like it's pretty serious, more so than it is with most guests of this podcast.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, over the last couple of years, related to the fact that I had to, in order to preserve my own professional integrity and my responsibility to the American public, I had to, under certain circumstances, publicly disagree with the President of the United States.
Hmm.
That immediately triggered a tsunami of hate against me by people who have a tendency to do hateful things, like
Yeah.
storm the Capitol and do things like that. So I became the target. The thing that people need to understand, that I have a great deal of respect for the presidency of the United States, and I took no great pleasure in having to contradict the president. Um, he wanted desperately for this outbreak to go away the way flu goes away when March comes and the beginning of April. He wanted it to disappear. My relationship with him in the beginning was actually quite good. We had a very good rapport together. I kind of described it as maybe, two people from New York City, one from Queens, one from Brooklyn. We had that New York rapport with each other, and we got along very well. But when he started to see that this outbreak was not going to disappear and it was going to sort of interfere with the economy and certainly with the election cycle, he began to say things that just were frankly not true. He would say it would disappear like magic. And then I would have to say, when the press asked me, no, it's not going to disappear like magic. In fact, it's even getting worse. And then when he realized it wasn't going to disappear like magic, he would invoke some magic elixirs like, okay, hydroxychloroquine is the answer. That's going to be the thing that's going to work. And when the reporters asked me, I have to say, no, unfortunately, that's not the case. It's anecdotal. Clinical trials show that it doesn't work. And in fact, it could be harmful. It's interesting, as I described in the book, is that he did not take as much offense as that as one might have thought. He maintained our good rapport. It was the people around him that became infuriated with me for what they thought I was undermining him, which was not my intention. I had no antipathy towards him, and I had certainly no intention of undermining him, but I felt it was my responsibility to the American public to tell the truth. That's when the threats started to come in. That's when the White House themselves tried to discredit me. I mean, the communications people at the White House did opposition research on me and started to say things to the press that, I didn't know what I was talking about, which is mind-boggling when you think about that. You're working in the White House, and the White House comms team are telling reporters that I don't know what I'm talking about, which is really weird at best.
Yes, weird at best is a good way to put it. You were in a position where, well, actually, your whole career was pretty much spent in a position where you have to often give bad news to powerful people, stuff they don't want to hear. And I assume you have some way of typically avoiding damaging those relationships while also being effective, because otherwise you couldn't really do your job. I mean, a lot of people, yeah, they want to shoot the messenger. You've experienced that. But I feel like a lot of people just tell powerful people what they want to hear and then try to slime their way around. But eventually they're going to get found out, and that's it.
Well, I describe in the memoir the first time I was getting ready to go into the White House to advise a president. And I had a close friend, much older than I, who had spent 6 years in the Nixon White House. And he gave me some advice that I would hope that I would have felt this way without his advice. But his advice helped me and fortified it. And he said exactly what you were alluding to. He said, whenever you walk into the White House, and now, Jordan, I've been in the White House hundreds and hundreds of times. He said, whenever you walk in the White House and you go under that awning in the lower level of the West Wing, just whisper to yourself, this may be the last time that I'm going to walk into this building, because it's such an awesome and heady place that your natural instinct is you want to get invited back again. So that might get you to tell a president or the president's advisors something that you think they may want to hear, as opposed to telling them what might be an inconvenient truth. So I said to myself, that's what I'm going to do. And I did that. I did that with Ronald Reagan. I did that with George H.W. Bush, with George W. Bush. And after a while, people begin to respect you because they know that you are going to be truthful to them. So instead of the messenger getting shot, it just got more and more rapport and respect for the different administrations. It was only when we got to the Trump administration that when I said that, more his staff than him were very offended by it and started to really try and discredit me. I mean, Peter Navarro writing an editorial in USA Today saying everything I'm saying is wrong, and the comms people essentially going along with that. I mean, that to me was, an example of, yes, I'm going to tell the truth, but if you want to get rid of me, then get rid of me. But I'm not going to tell you something because I think you want to hear it.
Yeah, I think it seems like you would know, as a physician, you just have to know, look, the entire country and the world kind of are relying on you to figure out how to stop this pandemic. So your feelings, Mr. President, or people in the room with the president, like, that is a distant second to like figuring out how to stop this thing from killing 1 million more people.
Absolutely. I mean, the main goal, people ask me, how do you tolerate that? What you need to do, Jordan, is you need to focus like a laser beam on what your purpose is and what your goal is. And if your purpose is to preserve and protect the health of the American public, then stick with that goal. And if something conflicts with that, then you're going to have to push back on it. And that's exactly what I did when I was saying that these magical elixirs don't work.
Thanks for watching us on YouTube. Remember, you can also enjoy The Jordan Harbinger Show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Our podcast feed is a treasure trove of insights from intellectuals, authors, spies, artists, athletes, pioneers, engineers, former mafia bosses, and business leaders, all sharing their amazing stories and secrets to success. For more information, click the link in the description. Now, back to the show. You've had a complete-ish loss of privacy since COVID, and that it seems like that's not likely to stop. I mean, I know you're at Georgetown now, so maybe it will slow down a little bit. I wonder how you adapted to that over the past few years, because of course, it's not always good, right? For every standing ovation at a restaurant, you got people who want to kill you with anthrax, real or fake.
No, I don't think the numbers are correct. I think there are many, many, many more people who want to applaud you and thank you for helping save them and their families and their mothers. It's the people who are against you are very loud and very persistent, and it sounds like there are a lot of them, but they're very, very loud and persistent. But getting to your original point, it's even worse than you think, because both myself and my wife and my children, we're very private people. I don't really like all the attention at all. It's there. It's nice when people are complimenting you and thanking you for saving them and their families. But I much would rather be a private person. And you're absolutely right. Your privacy is completely destroyed because, wherever you go, people recognize you. Almost invariably, they're complimentary to you. But every once in a while, you get somebody who just blasts off about why vaccines are killing people and you're killing people with vaccines and things like that. That's not pleasant, but you just have to accept that's part of it.
I know with AIDS, a lot of people, like we discussed earlier, were sort of against you. You're evil, standing up, heckling you. But there was no internet. There was no social media back then. Do you think that's been kind of the big driver of this?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. What you can do is that if you get 10 people who love you and one person who doesn't like you, that person isn't heard by very many people. But when that person amplifies their effect in social media and sending things on the internet and likes and non-likes and things like that, before you know it, the impact and the damage that one troll person can do is enormous, and it looks like it's much bigger than it is, and you get this impression, wow, look at all that chatter and people like clickbait. People are not going to click on something that is, oh, you know, we had an interesting time, and people said hi to Dr. Fauci and said thank you. But when somebody threatens to kill you, click, 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 click. You know, that's what happens, and that's the completely negative aspect, that social media amplifies so many things that are negative.
When it comes to COVID, what did some of the, I guess, so-called kooks get right? Did they get anything right? Not even if they got it broken clock is right twice a day style. Did they get anything? Did they happen to be right on anything?
Oh yeah, I mean, the fact that we were not perfect in what we did the best we can for the purpose of saving lives. That no response under such difficult circumstances is going to be perfect, and that's why you have, lessons learned to reflect on what you've done. I think there were several things that I think we need to think about. Shutting down when you were having 3 to 4 to 5,000 deaths per day was the right thing to do. Our hospitals were getting overwhelmed. We had freezer trucks in front of hospitals because you couldn't accommodate all the bodies in the morgue. The real issue that we should examine now, as retrospective lessons learned, is how long should we have kept the schools closed? I, for one, very early on, after a few months, said we should try as best as we can to as safely and quickly get the schools open. But yet you saw there were some schools that were closed for a year or more than that. And there are going to be deleterious collateral effects. So as you said, the people who complained, there was a kernel of truth in some of that. Also, the potential negative effect of mandating. I mean, you had a mandate in the beginning, but the idea when you mandate in a divisive society, that sometimes has the counter effect of people not wanting to do it. So we've got to re-examine the whole issue of mandates. There was a positive aspect in that it saved lives, but we've got to look at what the negative aspect is and says, what was the balance between the positive and the negative aspect? There's no doubt it saved lives. I mean, there's no doubt. But we need to carefully look at what some of the negative consequences are.
What happened early on with the mask guidance? I think that's sort of one of the reasons that people got tripped up and made a lot of folks suspicious. It looked like it's really hard to get to what even happened because it looked kind of like flip-flopping in a way because it was confusing.
Well, it certainly was confusing, Jordan, but it wasn't really flip-flopping, because when you have a moving target and information is evolving before your very eyes, the scientific process, which is a process to gather information, data, and evidence, and then make your decision based on that. In the very early months of the outbreak, what was not appreciated was that the virus was spread essentially by asymptomatic people, and that aerosol was important. And what we thought in the beginning was that, first of all, there was a shortage of masks. So to take masks away from the healthcare providers who really needed them, it was felt ultimately incorrectly that we didn't want to tell people they had to wear masks in January because the healthcare providers needed it. Number one. Number two, there was no evidence that masks outside of the hospital setting were protective. And thirdly, there was this lack of appreciation that there were people who were spreading it asymptomatically. So we said you don't need to wear a mask. Very quickly, when it became clear that A, masks do protect, B, there's no shortage of masks, and the virus is not just spread by people sneezing and coughing, it's spread merely by talking to somebody or singing. So that's when it became clear. Now, given the evidence we have now, weeks later, a month or two later, that's when we said you've got to be wearing a mask in an indoor setting. That was interpreted by some people as flip-flopping, when it really was using the data that we had in February and early March, which was different than the data that we had in January.
Yeah, I think when things move so quickly, it's very hard to you really any sort of change in direction seems like flip flopping, especially if you are not following the real science, quote unquote, every single day, which is your job. But for a lot of people, like, me sitting here with my parents, it's like, well, wait a minute. Didn't you say last month we shouldn't do this? Now we got to buy these and they're not available. And, that was kind of scary, I think. And when people get scared, they make these emotional knee jerk decisions that in large numbers. And that was kind of a disaster.
Yeah, there was one other thing about masking, Jordan, that was also a problem, is that when the CDC finally said we should all wear masks in an indoor setting, the president gets up and says, the CDC recommends you should wear a mask in an indoor setting. Me, I'm preferring not to wear a mask, which immediately politicized masking. And masking should not have been politicized. So if you wore a mask, you were interpreted as being anti-Trump. If you didn't wear a mask, you were interpreted as being pro-Trump. So the ridiculous situation evolved where masking became a political statement. And we know that. You see people fighting with people who were wearing masks that don't come into my store with a mask or don't come into my store without a mask. It became a political football, which is so ridiculous because mask is an intervention that is known to save lives. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, there was a lot of masking going. For example, in Asia, if you have a cold, it's kind of just one of those things where people with good manners will just pick up a mask and go, I got a stuffy nose, and so I'm going to wear this today on the subway or on the train, at work. So there was a kind of a culture of doing that when you're not feeling well. So they didn't have this same issue. And of course, they weren't maybe as tuned into the day-to-day drama that we have here in the United States. I know during COVID, people thought you were the one making the policies. And I guess I admit I was probably one of those people, but you're just more of a communicator of those policies. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, I mentioned that in the book. So the history prior to COVID is that I had been communicating to the American public for decades on HIV/AIDS, on pandemic flu, on Zika, and on Ebola. I was the constant because other directors of CDC or directors of FDA or other government people, they came and they went. They came and they went. I was there for a half a century and the director for 40 years. So the natural thing is that when you wanted to articulate to the American public what one should or should not do, I became the voice of and the communicator of these policies. And as you said, immediately everyone incorrectly thought that I alone made these policies. And you could see it from the responses from some of the congressional figures, where they would put me before a committee and say, when are you going to give us our freedom back? Like me? I mean, when did I take away your freedom? I was just communicating what the policy of the CDC and what the policy of the coronavirus task force was. I wasn't making that policy in a vacuum.
It seems like from everything that I looked at, and there's obviously a metric ton of information on this. In 2020, we just didn't have sufficient evidence to see where COVID-19 could have come from. We just weren't sure. But unless I misunderstood you, it sounded like in the congressional hearing, it sounded like you suggested it would have a natural, or sorry, you were restating this in the congressional hearing. But back then, it sounded like you suggested it would have a natural origin. And that was the thing, right? The bat at the wet market and yada, yada. Why not back then just say, hey, we don't know, especially once China started to block international investigations and look like they were kind of covering things up. It almost, to some people, they probably think you put your finger on the scale towards this not being a lab leak thing.
No, if you really listen carefully, I've always had an open mind.
Yeah.
But I've said it is more likely, because there's no evidence at all that there's a lab leak. But if you look at, there just isn't. It's just circumstance. There's no concrete evidence. Does that mean it didn't happen? Oh, of course not. I mean, we don't know what it is, and that's why we keep an open mind. But when you look at what the evolutionary virologists, not just people in the United States who worked for the government, people from Australia, from the UK, from the European Union, from Canada, looked at it carefully and said, with an open mind, that it isn't definitive, so we keep an open mind, but we think the actual virological, geospatial, and epidemiological data strongly suggest but don't prove that it's a natural occurrence. But having said that, since it isn't proven, you have to keep an open mind that it could be one or the other.
Is there potential possibility that gain of function research at the Wuhan lab is to blame for COVID-19? That's the question everybody keeps asking.
Yeah, but that's because gain of function is a meaningless term. What do you mean by gain of function?
Tell us what it is.
Yeah,
I think a lot of people don't know.
Because gain of function is a generic term that doesn't tell you anything. I mean, you make a vaccine for influenza, you use gain of function. You get the virus to grow better in eggs. You make insulin from recombinant DNA technology. That's gain of function of an E. coli that's spitting out insulin. It's when something is done that has the capability of enhancing the potential of a pandemic pathogen to spread more readily and to cause more harm. Now, that could have been done somewhere in China, but the place that it wasn't done was in the lab that the NIH indirectly funded through an indirect grant to a New York firm. Because when you look at the viruses that was studied under that grant, they were, the word phylogenetically, which really means precursor-wise, was so different than what SARS-CoV-2 turned out that no matter what you did to those viruses, they would not have become SARS-CoV-2. But yet in the beginning, people said, well, the NIH was funding a small grant, $120,000 a year in China. That's the lab that the virus came from, with absolutely zero proof of that. It was just stated that that was the case.
So I know I'm going to sound like somebody at the congressional hearing, and I'm trying to rephrase the question in real time, but here we go. Do you support an investigation into the lab leak theory, or is it kind of a waste of time at this point?
No. I think you've got to keep both possibilities open. Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we have good data about, not definitive, but good data that it likely was a natural occurrence. The only way you're going to find out about lab leak is you got to have open transparency with the Chinese. And given the degree of hostility and confrontation that we have right now, I'm not sure that we'll ever get that kind of cooperation.
Yeah, I think, and again, I'm paraphrasing. You said something like, even when they're not hiding anything, they've not been that forthcoming.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's a whole idea of saving face. I mean, for example, when COVID became apparent, they went into the market and got rid of all of the illegal animals that were not supposed to be there. Now, that gives you a big clue, as to, wait a minute, hold on here, folks. Why did you do that? And even, if you go back to 2002 and 2003, when the first SARS became available, I mean, we were aware of it in the Guangdong province of China. They were saying it's just an unusual flu because they didn't want the maybe embarrassment of a brand new pathogen coming from their country.
Right.
Which, there's nothing to be embarrassed. That happens, just the way the 2009 swine flu came from an area in the border between Mexico and California. Those things happen. But in order to essentially shy away from that, they were denying that it was a new virus until it got to Hong Kong, and then it spread through the rest of the world. But that's just the way they are. They're very, very secretive about things.
What do you make of the World Health Organization seemingly, in the beginning at least, not putting much pressure on Beijing to come clean about, to cooperate with a real investigation? Does that concern you?
Well, anytime there's lack of cooperation in a transparent way, that bothers me. I mean, I'm not so sure what WHO could have done. WHO is not a very powerful organization. They're at the mercy of the member states. So it isn't as if they have any direct authority. Certainly, we would have loved for them to have put more pressure, but I'm not sure that would have made any difference.
Do you ever think we will find the source of this virus given the environment and the time elapsed since its origin? I don't know much about how you
No.
investigate these things, but it seems like it's long gone.
I don't know. We would hope that if it's a natural occurrence, we'll be able to figure that out. It wasn't until more than 10, 15 years after the discovery of HIV did we find out that it actually originated in a chimpanzee. So it's not unusual not to find the origin for years and years later. One of the things that is going to essentially mitigate against that is the fact that the Chinese went in right away and cleaned out that market. So maybe the evidence that was there, if it was there, is gone now.
Would you say that COVID was the most challenging time of your career, or do you think it was the AIDS thing? I know there's a recency bias, but I'm curious what you think.
I think in some ways you can compare and others you can't. So when you say challenging, from a public health standpoint, to have 1.2 million people in the United States die is tragic. But in HIV/AIDS, I was personally every day taking care of desperately ill people for
Yeah.
years, watching them die, and as I describe in the book, probably getting accumulation of post-traumatic stress from trying to do a good job caring for your patients. At the same time, it feels like you're putting just a Band-Aid on a hemorrhage instead of actually stopping the hemorrhage. That was personally very painful for me. So
Yeah, I was looking for headshots. My team was looking for headshots for you for this episode where we have our artist draw you afterwards. And some of they were like, "You want us to use this one?" And there was one where you're about my age and you're checking out this guy who's an AIDS patient, and it just looks like you're handling an African child who's emaciated and malnourished, except it's a grown man. It's really kind of terrifying.
yeah, there were hundreds of those, Jordan. That's just one. Yeah.
Yeah, being literally hands-on with that would just be quite terrifying. What do you think you would have done differently with respect to COVID, just knowing what you know now, with the benefit of hindsight?
Well, I just mentioned a few of them. I mean,
Yes.
if I knew in the beginning what I know now, there would have been much more of an emphasis right from the get-go about masks. I'm not so sure it would have been accepted because I say, yes, we would have done it in January. Could you imagine if we had said when there were 2 or 3 patients that have died and maybe 20 that were infected, that, by the way, we want everybody to wear a mask? I mean, they would have looked at us like we were crazy. But that's something that we probably would have done earlier. And then also to re-examine the amount of restrictions we put on. And not only the amount, but the duration of the restrictions. I think that would have been done differently.
What keeps you up at night knowing that a pandemic, especially a respiratory pandemic like this, is happening or was happening? Just because COVID, well, I guess we're technically still in one. It's just not as sort of urgent, but it doesn't mean the next one won't be a month from now.
Well, Jordan, it's interesting because let's go from the beginning and go backwards before COVID. For literally decades, people, journalists, radio hosts like yourself, a number of people would be asking, Dr. Fauci, what keeps you up at night? What's your worst nightmare? And I'm on record for saying this hundreds of times. What keeps me up at night is the emergence of a brand new virus, likely from an animal reservoir, that's respiratory borne, that has high degree of efficiency, of transmissibility, and has a degree of morbidity and mortality that can have a major impact on civilization. And sure enough, COVID was the answer to my nightmare and my worst possible nightmare. Now you're asking me what keeps me up night now. It's the same thing. It's another respiratory borne outbreak that's highly transmissible and that has a degree of morbidity and mortality that can be very, very disruptive and painful. Because when you're talking about pandemics, it's got to be something that easily is spread from person to person. And the easiest way to do that is through the respiratory route. So I don't know when that next pandemic is going to occur, whether it's going to be 2 years from now or 50 years from now. That's one of the real dicey elements of preparedness because you've got to be perpetually prepared for something that you have no idea when it's going to occur. And that's a pretty high bar to ask people to be
Yeah.
constantly on edge for something that might not happen in your lifetime.
How prepared are we then for the next pandemic, in your opinion?
I think we're better prepared now because there have been some lessons learned than we were with COVID. I think scientifically we're quite well prepared. I think we still have a way to go to tighten up that public health system and get it to be less fragmented. So I think we have a ways to go in the arena of public health, but I think we're doing quite well in scientific preparedness.
I know some people, I was looking at this and it was almost comical. People were saying, oh, well, Fauci colluded with Mark Zuckerberg on Facebook to censor speech related to COVID. And there were some emails or something that were redacted in the pile that we saw in this FOIA, this Freedom of Information Act request. I don't know if this is something you're even able to say, but what's redacted there? Because I know the stuff is that redaction is out of your hands.
Yeah.
And people focus on that like, oh, it must be something super bad if it's blacked out.
You know, Jordan, it's ludicrous because what the email was essentially Mark saying, how about I have you on a podcast and see if we could help encourage people to protect themselves by getting vaccinated and doing things that they can to intervene and protect themselves and their family. It was pure altruistic. Somebody somewhere started redacting things like email addresses and words that were harmless words. So all of a sudden, that got construed in a fantastical way that I was trying to influence social media to say things that I wanted them to say, which was, you know, if it wasn't so stupid, it would be funny. But, but that's the source of this trying to influence social media.
Yeah, I think that's kind of how it comes across when you look at it and look at the context. I was just very curious about that because I would normally not ask somebody what's redacted because it's redacted. However, it didn't really seem like important things were actually could possibly have been redacted. It made no sense.
I know, and that I think, you know, and I've said this to the Congress. I mean, I think that in some respects the government is their own worst enemy. When they redact things that are harmless, you immediately incite suspicion that you're redacting something that is incriminating when it's like a silly word.
Right. It's like I'm going to meet you at blank and we're going to handle the blank. And what it is like pizza shop and lunch.
Yeah.
And it's like, just leave it in there. You're making us look terrible. You have no idea. I don't want people to know where we eat lunch. Yeah. It really comes across there's a whole world of possibilities. And at some point, the American public is just assuming the worst. Well, large numbers of us are assuming the worst. And it's just like it turns into some sort of television drama.
Indeed. I mean, it is fuel for conspiracies.
So this isn't really your problem anymore, I suppose, but it seems like we're always a few dairy workers or farm workers away from another pandemic. And by the way, I'm not blaming dairy workers or farm workers. Those people work their butts off. I'm just saying they're on the front lines of this and they're working with animals all the time. So is this kind of just media hype, or should we be doing more to make sure we're not incubating the next pandemic at some dairy farm in the U.S.?
You know, Jordan, it's my opinion as an outside person now that we really need to be testing the farm workers more for asymptomatic infection and find out the extent of spread. It's understandable why they don't want to be, because the farm owners, the dairy cow farm owners, don't want the federal government, you know, coming in telling them what their business should be. But there comes a time when what happens on the farm could impact what happens in the rest of the country. So they're leaning now towards giving them resources to do the kind of testing themselves, maybe in an anonymous way, so that you don't, because many of those workers, you know, are fearful that they're undocumented and they're going to wind up, you know, getting into trouble if somehow they get identified. And that's one of the reasons they don't want to be tested. So we got to figure out a way how to alleviate fears and concerns, but get the appropriate public health information that we need.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that. Looking at H5N1. That's kind of the thing that I'm worried about coming down the pipeline. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I honestly don't know much about H5N1 or why
Yeah.
it's dangerous.
Yeah, H5N1 is an influenza virus, influenza A. It infects chickens and is highly pathogenic to chickens. It goes back to 1997 when the first H5N1 was in Hong Kong, and they had to cull every single chicken in Hong Kong to get rid of it. Then it came back, in 2003 and 2013, et cetera. It just keeps on coming back. The somewhat alarming aspect of it is that there have been 900 cases in individuals, humans, over couple of decades. So it's really very unusual for it to jump species. I don't know what the number is, 900 or 90, I'm not quite sure. But there's a number of cases that jump species from a chicken to a human. It doesn't spread at all, or it's certainly not efficiently, from human to human. But when a human is infected, the mortality is close to 50%.
Oh,
So
wow.
that's scary. So
Yeah.
right now, H5N1 has gone and infected another species. Interestingly, dairy cows. It makes them ill temporarily with a mild illness, decreases the production of milk, and then the cows apparently recover. But farm workers spread it among the cows and back and forth. So what the concern is that if it keeps spreading in that circuit between farm workers and cattle and cats on the farm and chickens on the farm, that sooner or later it's going to mutate to be able to efficiently go from human to human and at a high mortality. That's what the concern is.
Yeah, that is scary. And we don't have a vaccine for that, or there's no reason to make one yet,
No,
or
we
what?
do, but we only have about 150,000 doses, but we have the capability of getting 150 million in about 6 months. So, this dates back when I was the director of the Institute. We made a stockpile of H5N1 vaccine that's still available. It isn't perfectly matched to the current virus, but enough to have some cross reactivity. But right now, there's over 100,000 doses that we could use right now.
If you were running things, is it a good idea to vaccinate those farm workers with that supply of
Well,
vaccines, or how does it work?
yeah, Jordan, that's a good question. That gets to the point of why I think it's important to do widespread testing of them.
Yeah.
Because if it's spreading beneath the radar screen, then you might want to vaccinate them. If it's only 3 out of, 1,000 farm workers who've gotten a mild illness, you might say, well, maybe it's not necessary to do it. That's why it's very important to do serosurveillance to get a handle around to what the extent of the spread is, not only among the cows, but among the dairy workers.
Surveillance. That's something Americans love. Yeah,
Yeah,
you got all the buzzwords today.
yeah.
um, and of course that means testing farm workers and people who are close to the animals. Just for people who are busy writing me an email. One thing I've heard from credible sources is that you've been offered jobs in pharma, private equity, I think, to earn something like 30 times your salary at the CDC, but you never took those jobs, even though you've probably had those offers for decades. Why?
Well, for what I was doing for that half a century that I was at the NIH and for the almost 40 years that I was the director of the Institute, was something that I think is priceless, Jordan. And that is getting involved in being the leader of a great group of people. You don't do it alone. You're just leading a team that did things, developing life-saving drugs for HIV, to put the PEPFAR program together, to develop vaccines for RSV, to be part of the team that developed a life-saving vaccine for COVID. I mean, to me, the gratification that you get out of saving essentially millions of lives and being part of the team, that's worth any kind of millions of dollars of salary doing something else. So I would take a government salary any day and have the experience that I experience rather than making $5 million a year, doing something that's good, but not at the level of gratification that you get when you're saving people's lives.
It sounds like having that meaning is very important to you. It's one of your core values from
Yes,
the outside looking in.
absolutely. Absolutely.
What do you want your legacy to be, in so much as you actually have a choice in the matter?
Well, I like the way you put that. Others will decide my legacy, whether or not what I did was value added to humanity. I think it was, but let others judge that. What I want to be remembered for is that in the 54 years that I was doing this, that every single day, without exception, I gave it 110%. And I always left it all out on the court. And if you remember me for that, I'm fine. The legacy issue, fine. Let others figure that one out.
Are you ever going to retire? I mean, you said you're a young 83, but now you're what, a professor at Georgetown?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I'm still energetic.
Hmm.
Thank goodness.
Yeah.
I'm healthy. I'm still passionate about teaching and about public health. And I just love being in the atmosphere of students on the Georgetown University campus. It's just an experience I had not had before, because at the NIH, you're surrounded by physicians, scientists, and specialists and people with multiple levels of degrees. But when you go to a university, you're dealing with 18, 19, 20, 21, 22-year-old people who have fresh ideas, you know, thought provoking, sometimes naive, sometimes off base, but always exciting. I really like that.
Yeah. I suppose that keeps you young. Although it would make me feel old when someone says, yeah, I remember seeing you on TV when I was 13, and now they're in a class that you're teaching.
Yep.
What do you think of being played by Brad Pitt on Saturday Night Live? I bet you never saw that coming.
Oh no, not even close. That was kind of funny. I've always been a great admirer of his acting capability, and the fact that he portrayed me was really sort of like, boy, this is really getting surreal here.
Yeah. Yeah, I bet. One before you go, there's an interesting leadership principle you talk about in your book where when you joined NIAID, you said, I refuse to make any big sweeping changes until I really understand the organization. And I think a lot of leaders, they join an organization and then they make big changes just to show like, hey, I'm in charge. I'm new here. I got to move some stuff around and put my imprint on this place so everybody knows what's what. You didn't do that.
No, I think that's a really bad idea. I mean, if you want to make meaningful changes and have the institution reflect your vision, you've got to really understand the institution. So for the first 6 months or more of my tenure, of that almost 40-year tenure, I got to learn every single aspect of the institution, every division, every program, every lab, every branch, travel around the country to our grantees to understand the granting process. And then once I really got my arms around it, then I started to figure out ways that we can do it better. But I just felt very strongly to just parachute in there and say, okay, we're going to change this, this, and that. I think that would have been presumptuous and likely, instead of being value added, it could be actually destructive.
Dr. Fauci, thank you so much for your time today. And I look forward to seeing you at the next Illuminati meeting. That's what everybody thinks when I talk to people of your stature. So might as well turn it into a runner.
All right, Jordan, thanks an awful lot. Really great being with you.
Thank you for checking out this entire episode on YouTube. If you want to follow up on this topic, check out our podcast feed or visit us on our website at jordanharbinger.com, where you can learn more about our guest and dive even deeper into what we discussed today. And remember, YouTube only has about a quarter of the episodes that we release here on the Jordan Harbinger Show audio feed. Any podcast app should have us. Check out the links in the description where you'll find access to all of our shows that don't appear on YouTube, such as Skeptical Sunday, where we debunk topics like crystal healing, GMOs, conspiracy theories, homeopathy, tipping, and even lawns to find out if they're backed by science and or logic. Also, our Feedback Friday episodes where we help people escape from cults, get raises at work, and take all manner of questions from you, the audience, and some of that stuff is dicey. Every episode of The Jordan Harbinger Show has something useful that you can take away and apply in your own life and help you navigate what I know can often seem like the overwhelming and paralyzing challenges of modern life. Thank you for watching, and remember to like, comment, and subscribe.